that one of our members, Michael McConnell, is going to help facilitate. Michael, for those of you who don't know him, I think is a really shining example of the power of individual philanthropy. I think when Michael became interested in addressing homelessness right here in San Diego, he didn't do it just by, donating to nonprofits and having a charity mindset, but really went out and connected with local leaders, with national leaders. And I think something that Michael really understands is the importance and the power of systems change and also the importance of advocacy in this work. So it is my pleasure to introduce Michael McConnell.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think one thing that Dr. Manuel, when she first started, really made me think of missed opportunities that we've had in San Diego. And I think hepatitis A was really one of those missed opportunities for us here locally. And I think I'd like for all of us to think about being prepared in our communities to really take advantage of opportunities. And sometimes they manifest in some pretty ugly ways, but they are opportunities for us to move forward. My name is Michael McConnell. I'm here a San Diegan. I'm a member of the National Funders Together, but I'm also a member of our local Funders Together network, of which there's quite a few. Actually, if our local San Diego Funders Together members would stand up just briefly, just so people could see who you are. And our director, Amy Denhart, there in the middle. So thanks to you all for coming out today. I've really tried to understand this issue from quite a few perspectives over the last 9 years. I'm a business owner, well, recently retired business owner, so I've had people sleeping on my doorstep of my businesses. But over the 9 years of volunteering on this issue, I've played quite a few different roles. I've delivered basic needs to people on the street. I've slept in safe parking lots to provide security. I've helped to lead local efforts to end veteran homelessness, put on educational events. I've done a lot of speaking on systems change, so a lot of the topics that we discuss in this room appeal to me, and I've learned so much from the National Funders Together members and these events. I do a lot on fighting and documenting the criminalization of homelessness because I believe that sets us back in our efforts. And then certainly funding through our local collaborative, which has been very powerful. And now I've moved into focusing on political advocacy and campaigning because I really feel the value in getting the right leaders, getting the right voices in our political offices to move real solutions forward. I just want to talk a little bit briefly about our local unsheltered population. We have about 5,000 unsheltered folks here in San Diego County. About 1,200 of those are living in their vehicles, and another 1,200 are living in tents or some kind of structure. 1,400 of those are chronically homeless. About 650 are veterans, 102 are families. 102 families with about 350 people in those families. 75 unaccompanied youth under the age of 18 live on the streets of San Diego County. 23% of our unsheltered are black. 5% are American Indian or Native Alaskan here in San Diego County. And a number not included in our HUD numbers, but that we do calculate here locally, is 1,507 people were in county jails on the night of the point in time count. That's 1,507 people that are coming back to our streets because we have few strategies in place for those people to go into housing and jobs from jail. So they'll just continue cycling through. So those are folks that probably should be counted, as well as all those folks that are in emergency rooms. So we certainly have a lot of reasons here to work on this issue. But for many of us, especially on the West Coast, unsheltered homelessness is a growing issue, and we know we need to act. San Diego has been front and center of the unsheltered debate, largely due to the hepatitis A outbreak that we had a couple of years ago that spread throughout the country and killed 20 here locally and infected hundreds, both homeless and housed people. But this outbreak was fueled by the unsanitary conditions on our streets and our large unsheltered population in encampments. This ramped up the debate between funders, electeds, and business interests about how to resolve it. But without a solutions-focused homelessness plan and implementation strategy in place, San Diego was left scrambling for answers. It was a situation that led to division and finger-pointing that still exists today. This also led to sidelining of evidence-based solutions and promising practices in favor of knee-jerk reactions. Those reactions have burned up a tremendous amount of resources and have had less than desirable outcomes. The need to focus on a systems-building approach has never been greater in San Diego and probably in many of your communities as well. But we must ask ourselves how funding a new shelter bed will lead to more people exiting homelessness. But we also must ask how we are going to immediately address the humanitarian crisis that we've allowed to fester on our streets, all while making smarter decisions. As a San Diegan who lives at the epicenter of this crisis and is deeply rooted in this work, these questions keep me up at night and drive me to help move real solutions forward. And that's really why I'm thrilled to be with you this morning to introduce this panel of amazing leaders who will help us all move forward with a renewed sense of urgency and empowerment to tackle this crisis that's devastating the lives and our communities. I'd ask our panelists to come up at this time. Matthew Doherty, the Executive Director of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Oliva, who's a Senior Policy Director at Corporation for Supportive Housing. And Mo George, the Executive Director of Picture the Homeless, a grassroots advocacy organization in New York. You can find their full bios on the Funders Forum webpage, and I encourage you to do that. The URL and QR code for the page is on the back of the agenda on each table, so you can link right to it. And I'm just going to start out by just asking, as soon as I find my notes, everyone on the panel, if you just share briefly about your work and the perspective, the unique perspective you bring to this conversation today. Mo, would you like to start?
Sure. Is this thing, can folks hear me? I actually don't need a mic. I'm an organizer, so I can project to the back of the room, but we'll use the mic. So I'm Mo George to my friends, Mo to all of you. I'm the Executive Director of Picture the Homeless in New York City. We're a 20-year-old organizing organization that was founded by two black men who were in the Lower East Side Bowery Men's Shelter, who wanted to start a member-led organization that led from those who were directly impacted. What that means is my members, who I work for, are actually either sheltered, unsheltered, or form lease or allies of homelessness, and they are the decision makers on the areas that we work on. We work on housing and civil rights, under housing, everything from the pushing of more affordable housing to we created and expanded community land trust across New York, to civil rights, which involves everything from the way homeless people are policed across New York City, because they are policed more than anybody, and also to, like right now, we have a campaign called Free to Pee that talks about access to bathrooms, which we normally don't think about, but something that our members have to. And for us, we, like I said, are member-led, so what that means is that our folks, you know, and a lot of our folks, we have a very active street homeless population, so it is not uncommon for a large number of our members to come to meetings, spend all day with us, and then go and sleep around the corner, and then be back with us at 10 o'clock in the morning. But the uniqueness of that is that their lived experience are what they're working to change. So they don't hear about homelessness, they actually live it every day. They know the system far better than anybody, have taught me tons since I've been there. I'm a union trained organizer, and before that doing housing work. But I will put my members against any experts out there, toe to toe, And trust me, they know the stats, they know the numbers, not just for New York, but also we have a sister organization called Cities for All in Budapest, Hungary. So that's what makes us unique, is I think we lead from those who are directly impacted.
Ann?
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see all of you in the audience today. Ann Oliva. I am the Senior Policy Advisor at CSH, or the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And I think, I bring a unique perspective for a couple of reasons. The first is work in homelessness is the only thing that I've done for my entire career. Started as a VISTA volunteer in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I lived with the people that we served in our program, and made my way around to various and sundry other positions. I spent 10 years at HUD as a career public servant. And towards the end there, you all know, y'all are funders, so you know how this goes. People stopped telling me the truth. They started telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. And that was very frustrating to me. So, there were a variety of reasons that I left federal service at the time that I left federal service. But I would also say that one of those reasons is that I wanted to get back out into the community. I came to HUD with a set of community skills and experiences that were no longer fresh. They weren't, and I couldn't get them to be fresh because people weren't telling me the real problems that they were. A handful, maybe some of you. A handful of people still emailed me on a regular basis to tell me what a crappy job I was doing, but generally that's not what was happening. And now I get to be in communities and working with this large national nonprofit organization where I have a portfolio that is very broad. And I'm working in San Diego. I'm working in LA and doing some work in Seattle. So I bring both of those perspectives. Now I have a little bit better on the ground feel for what's happening, and I have a list of things that HUD should change that I wrote into the regulations in 2012. I'll just hand that over to you. But I also bring the federal perspective because, and the funder perspective. So thank you for having me today. I appreciate it.
I'm Matthew Doherty, really happy to be here as well, and have deep roots in San Diego, lived here for 14 years, working in affordable housing and homelessness issues that whole time. A little bit of a different path, came out of CSH into federal service, but still trying to bring that community perspective and understanding of what's happening on the ground into this work. And I think for me, the perspective that's shifted a little bit actually since I left CSH is really focusing on that while we are working to build the longer term solutions, we're asking unsheltered people to bear the consequences of our failure to move quickly enough. And that's not okay for us to continue to ask people to bear those consequences while we still have to pursue the longer term solutions, but we're not the ones necessarily who are bearing those consequences and suffering from that longer term need to work on strategy. So we have, and then also see that as communities try to turn their attention to responding with urgency to that need, that it can also distort how they're responding to homelessness in general. We need to figure out how to respond with urgency to unsheltered homelessness, but not undermine and distort how we're responding to homelessness and the systems that we're trying to build. So that's been an increasing focus for USICH over the last couple of years. We built a stronger focus on individual adult homelessness and unsheltered homelessness into Home Together, the federal plan. I think Nan touched upon this morning, but the budget bill last week not only funded us, but actually extended the sunset date for USICH, which had been October 1, 2020, extended us to October 1, 2028. 2028, we've never had that kind of an extension. So we know we're gonna, as long as Congress keeps funding us, we know we're gonna be around to be able to continue to implement the federal plan. I'm kind of moving the microphone up close. I actually have a little bit of cold. Usually I can project to the back of the room. So we're gonna continue to work on those areas. We also first started to build in a stronger focus on unsheltered homelessness when we launched the criteria and benchmarks for what it means to end veteran homelessness, and then chronic homelessness, family homelessness, youth homelessness. And I will say that was not without controversy. We had a fair amount of pushback about whether we should be talking about that the end of homelessness meant nobody was unsheltered. There was concern that it would divert people's attention away from the longer term solutions, that we were saying that shelter was what people needed, not permanent housing. But for us, it just felt very important that if we are building towards an end state of homelessness, it's not going to be okay at that time to be saying you have to go sleep outside while we figure out something else for you because we have nothing for you tonight. So we continue to try to support that vision that we have to be aspirational about what we're trying to create for our communities. And we might not be able to get there right now. We might not even be able to focus on it 100% right now. But if we don't have that aspiration, we're never going to create that for our communities. So we've also been doing more work with HUD and with the National Alliance around an initiative focused on unsheltered homelessness. We're working to get to better data, to better understand the population, working with the California Policy Lab, looking at VI-SPDAT data and comparing unsheltered to sheltered populations. I think that data is going to be presented at a workshop here. We're trying to get to stronger practices. 'Cause I think part of our challenge here on this issue is that we don't have all the information to make the best case we can, because we don't know the information well enough, we don't understand the population quite well enough, and we don't have the full set of solutions and how to scale those solutions. So it's hard to make the case until we get to better information. And then also so we're working with about 10 communities to provide technical assistance to help them test and try new things and see what works and see what doesn't, and try to have a quality improvement kind of a focus to this work, and start to have better information to work with state and local elected officials and policymakers so they can make better choices as they need to respond to both their political dynamics and the urgencies in their communities, and then building towards a place where we can much better share and disseminate information and lessons learned.
Well, that was really great framing, kind of, because we want to just jump right in on balancing these investments. So the big question, and I think we've talked about this today, certainly in a lot of communities, is really, and it's a great source of tension, is especially in our big cities. So how do we balance those investments for the crisis response, the shelters and the shorter term housing versus the permanent housing solutions? So Ann, can you kick us off on that? And
Yeah, I'm getting a really fine appreciation for the challenges and barriers that our communities and people who are experiencing homelessness are facing every day. Not that I don't think that I was missing it, but I'm seeing it much more close to the ground at this point. And I think that it's all about balance and sort of understanding your resources and knowing how to make the case going forward. And for me, so the first place I always want to look is the data, right? But the data only tells you part of the story. It tells you the part of the story when you are doing an analysis at the local level and you have this much inflow, this much outflow, these many beds in these kinds of ways. You can understand to some extent where the gaps technically are. If you were to build this many new supportive housing units or have this many more rapid rehousing units, you could create flow through in this way, or have this many more emergency shelter beds, you can create flow through. But what I've been seeing on the ground, and one of the things that I've learned, is that those gaps are not the only gaps. There's another whole set of gaps that I think that a lot of communities don't understand, and that is the difference when you talk to somebody who is experiencing homelessness, the difference between what they want and what they want and need to exit homelessness versus what they are being offered is a whole nother set of gaps that I think is incredibly important for us to know so that we can build systems that are actually responsive to the people who are using those systems. So I guess I would say, it's about the balance, but the balance can't just be about the numbers and the money. It also has to be about the experience of the people who are using the system in a fundamental kind of way.
Mo, New York is a right to shelter state. So it makes that balance challenging, I'm sure. So can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of being a right to shelter state, and maybe even touch on what Ann was talking about as far as that gap between what people are offered versus what they actually want.
Yeah, so, you know, my organization, like I said, we're 20 years old and we worked on the right to shelter. And now we definitely have to be like, oh, what did we do? And a large part of that is because it has become the scapegoat to say, well, you know, particularly in New York, where currently, you know, our mayor has just announced that he wants to open 90 new shelters. And of the 90 new shelters, 35 would be new developments. So in a meeting with him, I said, and they wanted us to support. And I said, okay, if you could show me how the 90, including the 35 new ones, was one, not a business, and two, actually a way to eliminate homelessness, we would totally stand in solidarity with you. And I'm still waiting for the answer. And he says, well, his answer at the time was like, well, there's some shelters that are in disarray, and these would replace them. And we, you know, and we aren't in support of shelters, so we said that we understood that because there are some shelters that just are horrible places, and people have a right to housing, they have a right to live decently, and yes, even in a shelter, you should be in something decent. We agree with that. But 90 and 35 brand new ones do not see, to me, or any of my members, as an indication that you are committed to the ratification of homelessness. What it says to us is that you want to continue homelessness, and you actually want to do what we've said you're doing, is create the business of homelessness and not the business of ending homelessness. And that's problematic for us, because if you're committed to that, then you don't say we're opening 35 new ones. You say we're closing 35 because we have actually dedicated resources for permanent housing to be developed, so people can come out of the shelters and actually into what they want, which is a home that he and others around the room get to go to every night. So for us, that balance, right, we've totally tilted the balance. While we recognize and respect the right to shelter, we will no longer allow anybody in the administration across New York, whether it's governor, city, mayor, city council, to use that as justification to say we can't build affordable housing, whatever affordable means in New York, God knows, or we can't because there's a right to shelter. Because I think that that is a poor excuse and an excuse that's being used to not do what has to be done, which is eradicate homelessness. And attached to what you were mentioning earlier, we are also a part of a Close Rikers campaign. They talked about closing Rikers, and what they're not talking about, that we're forcing the conversation, is that Rikers houses 10,000 people, right? And of the 10,000, I think it's estimated that almost 40% of them come from public housing in New York City and cannot return to public housing in New York City. So you know where they're gonna end up? On our doorstep. And we're not having that conversation, and the mayor's not having that conversation, so we're forcing the conversation. So when he says, well, it's a right to shelter, then his justification was, well, that's why we needed the 35. Slick move, we're not falling for it. That's like, you know what I mean? We're not falling for it, don't use that. You didn't even think about it till we told you. You weren't even thinking about it till we brought it up. So I think it's a balance, but it's a balance that we've decided that we won't, while we understand the right to shelter, we can no longer allow people to use that as a scapegoat to why affordable housing isn't getting built, but yet we can build 250,000 units of luxury housing in the last 5 years.
But I think on the flip side of that too, there are communities that I'm seeing that are saying, well, we're only doing housing first, so we're not doing any shelter. One, that doesn't even make sense to me. Like that sentence, like together in that way, doesn't make sense to me, because housing first does not mean that you do not have shelter so that people are not residing on your streets. But again, it's this idea of an either or, when really what you need as a community, nobody has enough of anything. But like, well, I shouldn't say it quite that definitively. Maybe some folks have enough of some things. Yeah. But
Yeah, we kind of have
like,
it now.
like in New York City. So sorry about that.
Sorry.
I would just say that it's the mix of things and being smart about how that mix is operationalized in your community is what we want to do, rather than swinging from one end of the pendulum to the other.
Yeah. Matthew, do you have anything you want to add?
Just that Ann took my either-or comment.
I'm sorry.
I mean, one of the things that Ann and I were reminiscing earlier, that we used to do panels together all the time and figure out who's going to say what, which time. But one of the things I learned about Ann through her congressional testimony last week is that she likes to tell Congress people that they can walk and chew gum at the same time, which I think this is one of those walk and chew gum at the same time. It's not just picking one, it's figuring out a strategy that moves you forward and helps you help more people, helps you build towards the solutions, but helps protect people tonight as well. And I think it is a challenge to get to that right balance, and it varies from community to community. Some places it does not make sense to invest in more shelter. In other places, any investment in shelter gets spun as we've just wasted money we should have spent on housing, and I don't think that's appropriate either in any communities. So figuring out how to talk about both of these needs as a shared strategy for getting to the solution we want for the community.
Excellent.
Can I just add, while I respect both of my colleagues, I think allowing people to talk about both, I think you have to look at the city, right? Because if you allow...
No, agreed.
Exactly. Because allowing us to talk about both in New York is why almost 100,000 people are homeless in New York, because we've allowed too many administrations to talk about both. Instead of saying, let's stop with the shelter stuff, let's get out of the business of homelessness and actually get into the business of housing folks. So I think it's really important that we say that, that it's crystal clear that we cannot, and in some instances, especially in New York, we have to force them to swing the pendulum, because they've been teetering in the middle, and while they've been teetering, more and more folks show up on our doorstep every day saying, I just got evicted, I've been on the train. Like, I literally, before in January, had a 78-year-old man become homeless that had rode the train for almost 6 days. Because he had no clue, he had very little English, and he had no clue how to navigate the homeless system in New York. And one of our members saw him and started talking to him and brought him into the office. He's sheltered now. We're working to get him into senior housing, but this man literally rode the train for 6 days. That's unacceptable, and it's acceptable because we've not forced the pendulum to say it needs to be on this side, stop teetering, make some decisions, stick to them. That's why we voted for you.
I think Mo's given us some good lessons here in California, because California is considering a right to shelter bill.
Don't do it.
So it's certainly, some really good points that we want to be aware of as California moves forward and looking at doing maybe something similar. So thank you for that. And I think that, as I listen to the panelists, I think about what's happened in San Diego as our system has changed, and as we took away short and long-term shelter beds a few years ago with the expectations that we had this sense of urgency to create permanent solutions, which fell short. So now the pendulum is swinging backward the other way, and these things have to be very carefully thought out, like we're talking about, in a very systematic approach, and looking at the data, but not also just counting on everybody's going to want X, Y, or Z, but really looking at what people do want and what those true gaps are. Matthew, what do communities need to be thinking about and focused on as they strive to make progress toward ending unsheltered homelessness? And are there some missteps you see communities making that others need to be aware of?
Sure, and I think we've covered some of these already, but I see very few places that are actually starting with trying to better understand the population and to bring their voices forward. That happens very rarely. It's more decisions get made about what we think about these people and what they need, and we need to act now, and not really grounding our strategies and understanding who the people are beyond just demographics and numbers, and really understanding the obstacles they're facing, to asking for, or accessing, or achieving within success within programs, and not really looking at the obstacles we're putting in people's way. I think Nan talked a little bit about the political pressures and the need to act, which I think we do all have to understand. We are working in an environment in which some of those allies we need and the political will we need will face those pressures differently than we do, and we have to figure out how to help them act urgently, but not in ways that undermine the work that we're trying to build together. And it does feel like it's very easy in communities for decision-making to splinter when it comes to thinking about unsheltered homelessness, and for the structures that should be getting empowered to lead these collaborative processes get shuttled aside sometimes, and decisions just are getting made for the sake of making decisions. What I've been thinking about partly is that sometimes I think we pretend we're talking about both, but we're actually really only talking about one. Sometimes we're really only talking about shelter and pretending we're talking about housing, or the only thing we say about housing is housing's really hard, I'm not sure how we're going to do that. And so we put off those conversations, and I've been trying to watch the movement around climate change and see if the understanding that if we don't act urgently now, the problem gets worse every day, is a parallel for housing. If we don't act now and we just decide we're going to do that next year we're actually just compounding the problem. Not sure the climate change argument has quite made that shift in that case, but I think it's actually starting to get to a point where it's thinking about how to compel action now when it's a longer term challenge, but that if we don't face the challenge now, we're just compounding our problem. So trying to see if there's some parallels to think about there because when we act urgently, we often don't act urgently about the housing development we need and bringing units online. We treat those as long-term plans, long-term strategies. We'll do what we can, and we'll do other things urgently, but that just not only just puts off the solutions, but actually makes the solutions harder to create. I think the other thing that happens a lot in communities is that when they recognize that their system is not working well for ending unsheltered homelessness, they default to trying to do something new. They add something. They create a new program. They create a different kind of center. But they leave unquestioned the existing system. And the existing system often gets unchanged, even when they're demonstrating that the new things they're doing may be leading to better results. But there's a bit of an unwillingness at times to tackle the larger question about how are we responding as a community, and instead to pilot and test and innovate, but not translate any lessons back to the system that's already in place. And that's one of the things that we're trying to work with communities on is you may have to try something new, but if you only do something new, you're probably just working at this scale, and you have a scale over here that you need to be building in the new practices into. And then I think this is also a role for philanthropy, is that especially for some of the actors, this is risky to people's careers, whether we think they should think of themselves as having a political career or not, they do. Their careers are affected by how they are perceived as acting on this issue. And so finding ways that we can help mitigate risks for those actors so that they can make better choices, that they can take risks that are not just about themselves, but are collaborative risks that we're all sharing in while we try to figure out the best and most strategic options. And doing that through assessing our work, being honest up front that we don't necessarily know all the answers, we don't have all the solutions in place. It's not just a matter of doing our jobs better, it's actually we have to figure some things out and learn things, and being transparent about what we're finding and learning and trying, and what we're willing to let go of as we strive to get to better places, I think would leave us in a better position with the general public if it was not a sense of pass or fail, but really learning and trying to do better and striving on behalf of our communities. But I also think there's a lot of really exciting work happening. So that was all a bit of a downer of a list, but we're seeing communities who really are innovating around emergency shelter and who are thinking about investments in emergency shelter differently than they did even 2 or 3 years ago, both in terms of how that shelter is operating, the kinds of services that are provided, the kinds of opportunities that are available to people, the kinds of barriers that have been removed, but also the role that they're casting for their shelter within their systems for ending and eradicating homelessness is changing. We're seeing more communities who are thinking about outreach in an entirely different way, in a much more coordinated way, so that people don't sit on the streets for years and years with no meaningful conversation ever happening with them. But how do we actually invest in outreach that can help move people forward in their lives and towards solutions. And then I think there's a lot of promise in what communities have learned about diversion and how we can sometimes, for some people, divert their entries into the homeless services system through problem solving, somewhat easy fixes to challenges they're facing, and starting to translate those practices to people who are already homeless, and how much of that population can be served through those same kinds of diversion-like practices of problem solving, short-term financial assistance, family resolution. And really, that's, I think, an arena in which there's a lot more experimentation that we're starting to see happen and a lot more scale that could happen around that.
Great. Anne, can you share about the work you've been doing in Seattle and what's happening there?
Sure. Katie, correct me if I get anything wrong on this. So the first time I really started to understand the power and need and importance. I mean, I'd always felt like it was important, but when we did the youth homelessness demonstration program at HUD, we involved young people in that program, in the development of the program, in the way that the NOFA was structured, in deciding who the communities who were going to be funded were, and as TA providers. And that was the first time, like that fundamentally changed the way that I thought about my work. And so since I left the department and have been at CSH, I have had the lovely opportunity of being engaged in Seattle and King County to help them sort of get to the next level of work on towards ending homelessness in that community. We have partnered with Mark Dones and Britt Manzo and their team. They were called Future Labs. They are now called the National Innovation Service. They just changed their name. And this took some of the things that we did at HUD in my own mind and just like ramped it up in a way that I have been so incredibly impressed with. And I think that the work products are just so, they're just so much better. Because the work that we're doing in Seattle and King County is very much grounded in the voices of partnering in real ways with people with lived experience and racial equity. And when you start to orient all of your work towards those two things, it fundamentally changes the outcomes, and you might, you know, like obviously there's operational and administrative things that are going to come out of this, but it really changes the way that the community is thinking about their work. So, but there's always challenges to doing that, because when you orient towards those two things, it means that some of the people in positions of authority will have to give up their power. And what I've noticed is that on paper, everybody agrees with that idea. But when it comes down to actually doing it, they're like, oh, I thought you were going to give up your power. I wasn't planning on giving up my power. But we're working through that, and it is incredibly fun, and it's just such a, it's a real sort of honor to be working in that community while they are figuring all this out in a really progressive way. The funders, and I called out Katie as I started to talk about this, the funders have played such a huge role in this community. Not only are they funding critical pieces of the work to help support the community to move forward in the way that the community, based on their values and based on their theory of change, that they, you know, that they are pursuing, but they are sitting at the table with all of the other decision makers and helping to guide this process along. So the Rakes Foundation is sitting there, the Balmer Group is sitting there, the Gates Foundation obviously is there. We've had Vulcan, that's Peter Allen's group. We've had Microsoft just put in $500 million towards affordable housing. So the kind of impact that the funders are having in that community is both complementary and incredibly important sort of on its own as individuals and as organizations. So the work, we've done phase one. Phase one was really all of the work to try and get to the continuum of care in the city and the county and all the other cities that are in the county. On one page, in December, we had an incredible thing in Seattle and King County. We had a person with lived experience, the mayor, the county executive, the Rakes Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and Vulcan sitting at a table across, just all together at a table and doing a joint press conference saying, we agree to these values and these actions are what we are going to pursue as a community together. And that was the first time that I think that had really happened. So everybody is now marching in the same direction. They're aligning their resources in the same direction. And phase two will really be about implementation and developing a regional action plan that puts all of those values and the actions that we agreed to into real, granular action.
Well, it can happen.
It can happen.
Yeah.
It's going to happen here in San Diego. I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it. But it can absolutely happen. And, that community was ready. They wanted it. And it just has been really fun to watch.
Is there something that happened there that got them to this point that you can share really briefly that you know about?
I think the humanitarian crisis that you're talking about sort of got them to this.
Just got overwhelming and...
It's the number of people who are living in unsheltered locations in Seattle and King County is overwhelming just when you're walking down the street. There are not enough shelter beds in that particular city.
They can have some of ours.
All right. That works.
Well, that's great. I'm glad we were able to share something positive. And now we'll go back to Mo.
Yeah. No,
Mo,
but
go ahead.
Just one last thing. But I also think that this idea of the funders doing their own thing, getting frustrated. This is what's happening in communities all over the country. Me and my constituency, we are frustrated, so we're going to go do our own thing. The business community, Pearl Jam, whatever, whoever famous people you have in your community, being the owner of the Padres here, we're frustrated, nothing's happening, we're going to go do our own thing. The government going on and doing their own thing. And there was a realization at some point last summer, I think, that just was not working. So.
In our community, it was really the head tax.
Oh, the head
Oh, yeah.
tax, yeah.
It was such a debacle. And honestly, going back to your earlier comments around really shaking up our identity of the Pacific Northwest. We are known for innovation. We're known for coming together and solving big problems. And are you kidding me? We can't come together and unify on this crisis. So, honestly, the answer is hopefully, it can't get much worse. It's really very, very fragmented. We have 40 different tables. And so it was the crisis that I think forced people to come together. And philanthropy, we were part of the problem too. We've been involved in that community, but we've all selected our lanes. We've been deeply involved in youth and young adults. The Gates Foundation was deeply involved in families. United Way was deeply involved in the funds. And so I think but there was no one table where we were all coming together to say well, what's happening with the whole? How do we get out of our own lanes to think about the whole? So in some ways, I think it's hopefully we can't get much worse so that it'll be worse.
I couldn't say that. Katie could say that.
So that's certainly good news about Seattle, and we'll be certainly looking forward to hearing more good news. Mo, what is Picture the Homeless doing to lift up and center voices of people with lived experience, and have you partnered with funders to do this?
Oh, funders. So I love y'all. Let me put that out there first. To be honest, I think we're unique because we don't do direct service, right? We do organizing and advocacy. And that is sometimes hard, if I'm going to be completely honest, for funders to understand. But the way we break it down is that we can't get to the manufacturing of affordable housing, whatever that looks like in New York, if we're struggling with police violence against street homeless folks. We can't get to have that conversation if we're not working to shift the minds and attitudes of the narrative that homelessness looks like drug dealers. Our office, if you've been to New York, is in East Harlem. So we have a K2 epidemic now all of a sudden, right? And that is what gets described as what homelessness looks like, when actually 42% of homelessness looks like us that work every day but have to come home to a shelter or sleep in a car. That's not the conversation we're having. So when our members have to go out and actually do the work to sit down with the mayor's office, like we just had a press conference yesterday around asking the city for access to bathrooms. We're in 2019, y'all. Why do we have to have this conversation in New York, the Big Apple? I'm having a conversation about peeing, really? 2019? Why? That's just not something we should be talking about. But that's the work that has to get done, because my folks can't go to the restroom. If you've been to New York, you know we have a Metro. Our office is on 126th Street. We have a Metro North train station around the corner that's pretty well lit. Tons of our street homeless folks have called that area home because it's well lit and it's safe for them. Do they want to call it home? No, but it is well lit and it's safe for them. They've been other places and gotten beaten, mistreated. They've had things thrown on them, so they tend to congregate around the well-lit area. That bathroom was intentionally closed, and they told them it's your fault why we can't open the bathroom. So none of the surrounding stores, they want you to buy something, right? But I've seen my members walk into some of the stores and say, hey, I want to buy a soda so I can go to the bathroom, and then been turned away, right? And that's not uncommon. So for us to have to do work like that, right, it's sometimes a struggle having funders understand that we're not doing services. But if we don't do that work, then people don't have, the right to go to the bathroom, hence why we named the campaign Free to Pee, right? And that is just as important as them getting housed. If they choose to be street homeless, they can't access a bathroom, but yet are given a ticket. And in the last 3 years, New York City Police have given out over 17,000 citations for public urination over the last 3 years. Like, members dug this information. I'm not that bright. They do all of this, And to stand there and have to then develop a whole campaign. And when they first came into me, because I don't have that issue, I'm like, wait, what? And as they talked about it more and more, you saw that that's something we have to do, right? We have 428 subway stations in our New York City transit system, 428. Each train station has 2 bathrooms. That means New York subway system has over 1,000 bathrooms. Only 53 are open. Good luck finding the 53.
Whoa.
53. But then we have to then work on the MTA to say, you got to open more bathrooms. And when we did this and had a press conference this summer around it, we've got organizations coming to us like the Grandma Brigade, and an organization of that represented pregnant women that says, you know what, we have bathroom access issues as well. So it gets a little complicated to describe that kind of work to funders, right? Because I think we've gotten into the mode of services and housing. But there are a lot of things underneath that we provide. We have a homeless organizing academy, which is a 20-week school that members attend that actually helps incorporate them back into living in a home. If you've been someone, and we have that, we have a veteran who's been unsheltered for 17 years. He's home now, has a home, has a key. The last year and a half, he's still living out of a bag. And we came and we were like, wait. And somebody says, oh, listen, he's still living out of a bag. So we as staff went, found people donated mattresses and curtains, and we turned his apartment into an actual home because nobody had actually taught him how to live in a home now. So he was still, even though he'd been there a year and a half, living in a bag, like any day somebody would ask him to leave. So in our Homeless Organizing Academy, one of the things we talk about in it, and one of the classes is, right, what does it mean to have a home? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What are those responsibilities? And that's not, that's not something people would typically think about when they're talking about homelessness, but that's what somebody who's been street homeless has to think about, right? They have to think about budgets. We talk to them about budgets. They have to think about paying bills. My brother is homeless. My brother has never paid a bill. He's come out of rehab last year, and this year I have him paying his phone bill. He was traumatized. I was like, dude, you gotta learn to pay a bill. You really have to learn to pay a bill. But we take that for granted. So now he is in the routine, and he's like, oh, and now he's totally excited. Pay my bill. I was like, nah, that's right, boy, pay your bill, and soon you'll be paying mine. But he has to get, I had to know that that's something he had to get into the routine of doing. So I say that to say that when we partner with funders, our hope is to have them understand the actual work we do, that although it's not direct service, it's just as valued, it's equally as needed, and that we really do need funders to support that work. Because we do work around community land trust, and that tends to be like really, really like attractive. Oh, that's housing. And then when I say, well, listen, I really need folks to support our Homeless Organizing Academy, then people go, not that much. So I think, what we're trying to do, and I'm new to PTH. I've been the director now. This is going on my second year. What I'm trying to do, as with the relationship that I've built with funders, is one, bring them in so they can totally understand. We're about to launch the Homeless Organizing Academy, so folks know what it is. It is actually a school that they apply for. They get a certificate. We have a graduation. We do it all up. And to have them understand why it is that I don't need you just to support our community land trust. I need you to support the other work, right? I need you to support the work that we do to shift the mayors, because another recent act, there's an act of our mayor that set aside $25,000 new of his grand plan specifically for homeless folks. The man has said no 4 times. And it just baffles me. So now we have to spend more time trying to convince this dude that a $25,000 set aside is not uncommon, and that his answer of, well, everybody needs to be housed, is not sufficient. But they have to organize around that now. So I think for us, it's really about having folks understand that service is vitally important, and we support, all the groups that we work with. We work with Coalition, we work with, a lot of folks that are doing, national folks that are doing work on homelessness in New York, but that the organizing advocacy side is a pivotal side, and it's an important side, and it has to be funded.
Well, New York and your organization is lucky to have you, so.
We're trying.
And happy to let you know, so our local Funders Together organization just funded our first advocacy grants and our 2 grants, and you'll see one of the organizations in the morning. It's the Voices of Our City Choir. It started out as a choir for people experiencing homelessness, and they've become very powerful advocates in the community, all by themselves, just a grassroots effort. And hopefully I'll be able to connect them up with you, because the work you're doing there is just amazing.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
So let's just move on to really focus on the conversation about how funders can be good partners in this work. And Mo, you've kind of touched on that. But Matthew, what opportunities do funders have that government partners don't have?
Sure. So I think we've touched upon the fact that as more community awareness and concern is generated, it actually sometimes can amp up the pressure that public systems and public officials are feeling. And I think when you're in a pressured environment, sometimes it's harder to feel like you have the room to take risks with money, with strategies, with longer term focus. And so I think that's part of what compels some of the urgent, short-term focused, something has to be visible now, because otherwise nobody can tell that I'm doing anything. And so I think there's a role for funders to try to help create an environment in which that is not the only, that's not the only proposition that can move forward, that there can be a way to build out the kind of collaborations that maybe are starting to come together in Seattle King County, so that there is a shared sense of risk and not any one individual is on the hook alone for trying to be their community's fixer around these issues. And to try to drive a conversation that is about needing to try things, do things differently, change things over time while acting now, so that it again doesn't become a pass-fail equation only. And I think that's the dynamic that we see a lot of places, is that that did not work, so we failed, or that person failed because they made this wrong choice, rather than they actually tried to make a good choice, but we need to help support them to make a better choice. So I think there's a role for funders to try to create more of that environment and to use their money in ways that help support that kind of risk-taking and acknowledgement that failure might occur. I also think it is a place in which real skill shifts are going to happen for the folks working in the homeless services sector. And I don't think public money is the easiest money to use to support staff to develop different ways of thinking about and doing their jobs, and different ways of interacting with people, different ways of offering opportunities, different ways of engaging people and understanding and really putting people at the center of decision-making processes for their pathways out of homelessness. And I just don't think that public money does that very well, because again, the dynamic is if we're not spending it on beds or units, we're probably wasting the money, and that people should just figure out how to do this differently. And it's actually just, I don't think, enough to say just do it differently. So the role for public money, private money to invest in skill building, capacity building, supporting staff to think about their roles differently is probably something that private money can do better and can have a lasting impact in a way that public money would likely struggle to come to the table in that way.
Great. Ann, you talked a little bit about your work in Seattle and how funders, help bring people together, but do you have any examples or any thoughts on how funders can help actually build the political will by being that kind of force in the middle?
Yeah, in a lot of communities that I'm doing some work in several communities, funders are like the connective tissue, if that makes sense. It's doing the work of convening, it's doing the work of maybe mediating or pushing the community in a specific way to get at certain kinds of practices. And I'll give you an example that is not Seattle. In DC, which is my home community, I worked in DC for many years before I went to HUD. A funder came and said, we're hearing from landlords in this city that on any given day, there are 20 different nonprofit or government organizations calling them to get one unit that is available. There is very clearly a mismatch in many ways between the number of affordable units that are available and the number of people moving through the homeless services system that need to access those units. Is there a way that we can help you be more efficient? So through the power of this funder, they came into town and they convened sort of the big players in the homeless services system, as well as sort of like community development and the downtown bid, and said, we will give you money to help develop a more efficient way of addressing, of both providing units to people who need those units, because like in many cities, the number of units that are available are actually, there's a large number of units available, it's just none of them are really affordable to the people who we serve. So there's like a tiny number of units that are affordable to people that we serve, and the rest of them are these luxury apartments, right? So how can we make this process more efficient for 3 levels? People who are experiencing homelessness and need to get back into a unit, the staff who are working in this area who are now calling inefficiently all over town looking for a unit when they're competing against other case managers or housing navigators, sorry, and for the landlords, because landlords don't know who to call. They don't know how to get their units, into the mix, or some of them do, but whatever. So, so this particular funder said, we will fund you for a year to figure out how to do this work in a different way so that you all can be more efficient. And if you do this, the carrot in the long run is that we will help you set up a landlord mitigation fund. So, you know, I can't say that all those players would have come to the table just to do the landlord engagement piece, but the mitigation fund sure did make them come to the table. And now we're in the process of developing and hopefully soon implementing a new, more efficient system. So like that connective tissue is so important because nobody, it doesn't naturally fit in either the service provider arena or in the government arena. So it just can like bind things together in a way that, that really creates opportunities in communities.
Great. Well, I know you've talked about funders being good or not so good partners in this work all the time.
I didn't say not so good.
Okay, I was reading between the lines a little bit there.
Hey, I'm new. Don't be getting me in trouble.
But can you talk about other advocacy efforts that need to be done with other sectors and systems? We obviously building a homeless service system. There's lots of, as you talked about with Rikers and those folks coming out that aren't eligible for public housing assistance anymore. Can you talk about any other advocacy that either you're working on or needs to be worked on with other sectors?
So, I mean, I think right now our work with Rikers Island, and we're actually doing it, how we got to the table around it was a funder who came and heard our name and came and talked to me and was like, listen, this is what's about to happen on Rikers. And I attended a meeting and they didn't seem to fully talk about the impact that the closing of Rikers will have. And what does that mean? You know, what does that look like for homelessness and access to any kind of housing in New York? And in my conversations with her, I said they're also not thinking, because they didn't know it, the impact it would have directly with public housing, and the fact that folks who are have any kind of record cannot technically, you know, return to public housing, and what that looks like and what that means. So where the conversation is now is, you know, she was like, well, I want to talk to you about what this could look like. And I said, well, listen, let's bring a few folks to the table who are actually working on housing in New York and homelessness. And what we did is they funded a meeting, and we brought about seven groups around the table to talk about what this would look like, especially since our mayor has decided to accelerate the timeline around Rikers. And we felt like something needs to go before him. So the end goal that we're at now is to develop a white paper that actually talks about some recommendations around returning citizens into the communities and what that looks like, and gives recommendations around how to work with NYCHA and what that looks like. So there's the work we're doing around Rikers Island, that stuff, and like I said, with the funder. And then I think some other exciting work is at the beginning of last year, we passed something we had been working on for 11 years. It's called the Housing Not Warehousing Act, which was three bills that actually would stop landlords from warehousing apartments in New York. One bill asked them to do a count of vacant properties. The second bill said that those properties need to be on a registry so folks would know where they are. And the third bill said that if landlords did not put their property onto the registry, they could be assessed a fine. So we got two of the bills passed last year around the count and the registry. We're now working with a different department in the mayor's office, because one legislative side is problematic, but a different department on actually working out what those bills should look like and actually pushing them to say that they can't do a count. they can actually do a count without it being this $1 million venture where my organization has done a vacancy count twice and counted more than 150 units. So we're saying that you can act, because they're saying, oh, we have to do a count and get some firm that they want to pay $2 million of, when our little group, 2 times in its 20-year history, have done, most recently in 2014, an actual vacancy count and counted more than 100,000 vacant apartments across the 5 boroughs. Now, if we could do it, nowhere is my budget $2 million. It's probably about $2 today. The city can afford to do it without spending massive amount of money. And actually, the funder that we're having the conversation with around Rikers, I was mentioning this to her, and she, sort of got interested in that as well, that we could do a count for far less, and that what a concept, maybe we should actually employ homeless people to do a count. I don't know, my God, give homeless people jobs. What a concept. So, and that, and that could be pushed forward. And I think them lending their voice to this part of the conversation will actually be far more beneficial to getting the count done and actually employing, homeless people to do the count and make sure and actually watch that the registry is developed. We're working on the third part of the bill around the assessment of fines. We're having a little problem. We heard the Catholic Church is a little mad at us for that part. But the bottom line is I think that there is a lot of opportunities to work in collaboration. We're seeking out those opportunities now. And, the program officers that we have now, I have not been shy, and I'm a little shy, I'm just kidding, about saying this is the work we're doing. We would love if you partner with us, because I think to what you were speaking about, they actually lend far more voice to things and oftentimes can get the mayor's attention or others' attention that we can't, and that has actually worked for us, because now the conversation around actually doing a count or having homeless people being paid to do the count is a real conversation, where when we mentioned it to the mayor's office, it was like, ha, 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 ha. And we're like, okay, so you want to pay somebody another $2 million where you actually can keep it in the communities with the most need. So I think there are a plethora of opportunities, and I'm happy to talk to folks about all of them.
Well, it sounds like you're about as tight with your mayor as I am with ours, so.
Yeah. He just honored me the other day. I was like, whatever. Like, don't, like, keep the honor. I'm still gonna yell at you. So.
There you go. Well, we have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody has any pressing last minute comments, take a minute, and then we're gonna go to questions.
Last thought would be, I think we still also have a lot more work to do to connect the advocacy around affordable housing and the advocacy around homelessness, and not to treat those as 2 separate strategies. I think one of the risks that sometimes plays out is as affordable housing advocacy starts to get better at making the case, connecting people to the issue, they sometimes use, and to my mind, exploit the issue of homelessness to compel support, but then bring forward units that will never help address homelessness, which both undermines our shared set of strategies here, and also I think ultimately undermines public support when they feel like if they're not living in the unit and the unit's not solving a problem they thought it was supposed to solve, why are they going to support continued investments in affordable housing? So I think really trying to bring these sectors together to see themselves as one housing stability, housing focused sector, rather than playing in the same field, but playing really sometimes from two different playbooks entirely.
And some of these conversations are really hard, and communities need some guidance and I like the thing that you said, Matthew, around shared risk. And one of those topics that I think Amanda has been incredibly important in terms of leadership, and the foundations, the funders in Seattle have been incredibly important on is racial equity, and being able to help drive that conversation forward in a way that that is constructive and positive, but is also acknowledging that it is sometimes a very difficult conversation to have at the local level. So, you know, being able to use your voices in those ways, I think can really help a community maybe get over a hump or get over a barrier or get past being scared to talk about these kinds of things. And I want to make one note. I said it was a landlord mitigation fund. We don't want to mitigate landlords in DC. It's a risk mitigation fund. And it just like replayed in my brain there for a minute, and I was like, that was the wrong word. So,
Mo, any last comment?
So I just think for us that there is tremendous opportunities to work together, and I'll just echo what I said before, that I hope folks realize that advocacy and organizing is vitally important and just as important as supporting services. And I do agree that the affordable housing conversation, homelessness conversation has to be two conversations. And I know for us, especially as we have what's called 2020 vision, our goal is to make sure that housing and homelessness, and really homelessness, is a vital conversation on anybody's lips that wants to run for president of this country.